Hello again. My name is Keith Mosher Sr. I happen to be one of the instructors at the Memphis School of Preaching. We are privileged to be in our 47th year at that school, training preachers to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. I come to you today from the studios of the Gospel Broadcasting Network, and this is a study of the book of Daniel. And we approach today chapter 8 of Daniel. And I hope you will open your Bibles to that section. And let me read the first verse to us and then make some comments based on the name of the king in this verse. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. In the mid-6th century before Christ, Cyrus united with the Medes and conquered Lydia and this king Belshazzar. That was 539 BC. That was the day that Belshazzar died. Now, that record is in the 5th chapter of Daniel, so we have something that's not in chronological order here, but it's in topical order. The British Museum has a clay artifact called the Cyrus cylinder. It shows how Cyrus published his conquest of Babylon. And in that cylinder, or on that cylinder, we read about an incompetent ruler in Babylon called Nabonidus. We know that that is Belshazzar's father, who was co-regent with his son. Nabonidus was off making a temple to his god and was not in the city when Cyrus conquered Babylon. Cyrus, according to the cylinder, thought that Nabonidus had tried to eliminate worship to Marduk, because Nabonidus worshipped a god called Sin, sin, of all things. But Cyrus thought of Marduk as the king of the gods. He summarized that Nabonidus continued to do evil against Marduk's city. And so you have a reference here that helps us understand how these ancients thought about other peoples that they conquered. They believed they were conquering the people's God. Cyrus added, Marduk surveyed and looked throughout the lands, searching for a righteous king. Well, Cyrus is referring to himself. His favorite, he called out his name Cyrus. He pronounced his name to be a king over the world. And Marduk, he says, ordered him to go into this city, Babylon. Well, that's interesting the way that Cyrus thought about it. But you have now the name of the man who conquered Belshazzar. And we are told by Daniel that Belshazzar saw the handwriting on the wall, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. You've been found wanting when you were weighed in the balances, and was put to death by the armies of Cyrus that very night. That cylinder that's kept in the British Museum contains a description of Cyrus given by himself. He calls himself the king of the world, the great king. I've often wondered what he thought when he was shown the Jeremiah scroll, or perhaps the Isaiah scroll, and saw his name there a century before he was ever born. Well, he probably became more enamored of himself than he was before. But he called himself the great king, the mighty king, the king of Babylon, the king of Sumer, the king of Acadia, the king of the four corners of the world. Well, he bragged a lot about himself, but he is the one now under whom Daniel is going to have to live after Belshazzar dies. But in our chapter 8 now, Daniel is talking about a time when Belshazzar was still living, and Cyrus had not come yet as the king of the world. Cyrus always advertised himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. And he would tell people, I'm liberating you so you can worship Marduk and so on. He said, your own God told me to do this and that kind of thing. And so he tried to have good public relations with those whom he conquered. When Cyrus' first year now is 539 BC, so the vision here of Belshazzar's time is prior to that. What exact year this is, we're not told. The Jews would not be allowed to return until Cyrus secured Babylon, and so that would be about 536 BC. And that's when about 50,000 Jews returned from captivity. And so let's talk about chapter 8 of Daniel. And I'm going to give it a title just for study purposes. There's no title in the Bible here on the chapter. But I'm going to call this the Kingdom of Macedonia. And Daniel calls this a vision, a devar, not unusual. Ezekiel spoke of his writings as a vision, Ezekiel 8:3, Ezekiel 11:24, Ezekiel 43:3. John the Revelator spoke of his as a vision. Paul was allowed to have a vision of the third heaven, 2 Corinthians 12:2. And so this would not be unusual for a prophet. And here we have another vision, a devar. Isaiah 1:1, where we read that he wrote the vision of Isaiah the son of Amoz during the reign of certain kings. It would be interesting to know how that vision appeared. Was it something as if they were looking at a movie screen, or was this a mental picture? Did they have to close their eyes to see it? But here is a vision. And we have a historian back here named Siculus who summarized the Macedonian career of Alexander. And we're going to come to him eventually in this chapter, Alexander the Great. So let's call this chapter the Kingdom of Macedonia. Alexander's career lasted about 12 years, and he conquered no small part of Europe and practically all of Asia. That's Siculus, section 17 of his work concerning Alexander the Great. Let's go back to the 8th century BC in Macedonia. And prior to that time in history, it was disorganized, but a man named Philip began to organize it. The Greeks viewed the Macedonians, however, as barbarians. And so when we look at a map of that ancient world, we have to talk about the top part of what we call Greece, Macedonia. The southern part, where Corinth was located, Achaia, is Greece. Well, these Greeks down here thought of these northern Macedonians as barbarians. They were very bad people. They had no humanity about them. Well, Philip of Macedonia, Philip II, organized the Macedonians, and he did so as a military power. So in the background behind this vision is the rising power of Macedon. Now, Daniel would not know about that, but he's going to have a vision about it. He's going to have a look at something that will occur long after Daniel's death in 359 to 336 BC, when Philip II of Macedon organized that country into a military power. The Greek army or the Macedonian army, that Philip organized, the hoplites, hoplites. They were heavily armed people and infantry. They used an 8-foot-long spear in their battles. And they had a large round shield called a hoplite. So the hoplites. And they would fight close together in a phalanx so that the shields kept arrows from hitting them. They could even hold them over their heads. And that phalanx became a popular way of fighting that Philip organized. Philip added a companion cavalry, however, to his phalanx. And he had a method of training these people so that they knew exactly when to come into the battle. They knew how to go forward with those shields and that 8-foot-long spear. And so you now have a people very well armed. And when Philip got strong enough, and his army was strong enough, he invaded Greece. Sparta was a weakened city-state in those days. And Philip went down there and invaded Sparta and Athens. And in history, if you take ancient history, these wars are called the Peloponnesian Wars. Well, Daniel's going to have a vision of this time in history. And in 3038 BC, Philip overcame Greece and formed the Hellenic League. The League of Corinth, it was sometimes called. About that time, however, one of Philip's bodyguards killed him. There is some evidence, at least there are some who write, that Alexander, Philip's son, organized that assassination. I don't know about that. I do know some have surmised that that might have been what happened. And so Philip is now assassinated before he can invade this Persian territory that Daniel's going to see in his vision. Alexander the Great is now 20 years old. 20. He will die at 33. Persia thought they would be able to defeat that young, rash Alexander. These satraps of Persia in the area of Turkey immobilized. They got together, they're going to defeat this upstart Alexander. Well, Alexander got on a ship for Asia Minor in 334 BC, and he beat those Persians at Grancus. Then he took Darius III, the main Persian army, at Issus, and he secured a mountain pass into Syria. The Persians will retreat all the way to Babylonia. While they are retreating, Alexander the Great will take all the coastal areas held by the Persians. He will reach modern-day Pakistan, where he will stop, finally. And we come today to a moment in history when Daniel is allowed to see all of that I just mentioned. All of that in detail? No, but the background to it. This chapter 8 is an amazing, concise, precise vision of history itself in which Daniel is not living, but he sees it. I'm going to guess that this first verse of Daniel 8 is in the first year of Belshazzar's co-regency with his father. That would make this about 549 BC, I'm guessing. I'm not sure. Or maybe we've moved up a couple of years and it's 547, 546 BC. I don't know. But I do know Daniel is very much older here than he was when he first came to Babylon. He was brought to Babylon probably as a teenager. Daniel is somewhere around 70 years old now. And he has, in this vision, a chance to develop for us the second and third empires of his first vision, or the first dream of Nebuchadnezzar concerning those four world empires. Now keep in mind that Daniel is centered around Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. So anybody who tries to take these visions past those four world empires is going to miss what the book is teaching us. And so Daniel is now going to tell us about the second empire, Persia. He's going to tell us about the third empire in this chapter, Greece. And we're going to learn about what Daniel saw. And he will see something else that bothers him. Daniel is much hurt by this. He's troubled. You remember when we were studying chapter 7, we talked about how troubled Daniel was at seeing these things. Why? Because they involved his Jewish brethren. And some of these things would injure the Jews. And so that troubled Daniel, especially during the era of the ones who succeeded Alexander the Great. Now, Daniel is physically in Shushan, Susa. Susa. Let's read it, verse 2. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass that when I saw that I was at Shushan, in the palace which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Eula. Susa. Shushan. Ancient city, located in the Zagros mountainous area. It's about 160 miles east of the Tigris River. Daniel's not in Babylon. Important point for our later thought. It would be in modern-day Iran, where Daniel was located at this time, when he had this vision. One of the most important cities of the ancient Near East, Susa served as the capital of this area, the capital of Elam. And it was a winter capital sometimes of other empires. There are 3 archaeological digs going on there right now, and they've covered an area of about a square kilometer. The modern Iranian town of Shusha is located right on the site of this ancient Susa and Shushan. This city, incidentally, is mentioned by Esther in her book. The ancient Greek word Susa, it comes from an Elamite name originally. And so we have here a time of Cuneian and cuneiform thoughts. They started digging this site around 1851, and they discovered it's one of the oldest settlements of that region. When they carbon-14 dated some of the finds, they dated what they were discovering at 4400 BC. So this is a site that's been here for a long time. It's interesting that in this area, the early inhabitants built a platform, a huge platform. This site is still recognized today as one of the ancient wonders. And then the ceramic vessels they found in that site at Susa were being placed there as offerings to their god. So when you start studying this town of Shushan, well established in history and well known to archaeologists, and they've been digging there for years and years and years. And so you have here now Daniel in Susa, Shushan, not in Babylon. So the vision, however, takes him to the river Eula. This is a canal around Susa. Down there southeast of Babylon, actually about 220 miles. Modern Iran. Let's keep in mind where we are now. Let's look at verse 27 here and then come back to where we are right here. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward, I rose up and did the king's business. I was astonished at them, but none understood it. This vision was so troubling to Daniel that he fainted. When the Persians conquered Babylon, they were so in admiration of Susa that they made it one of their royal cities. This site is somewhat sacred then to the ancients. Now, since Daniel's in Susa, this may be why Belshazzar didn't call him immediately when he had the vision. I said keep in mind that Daniel's in Susa because that helps us with chapter 5, where Belshazzar has this vision, but he doesn't call for the prophet immediately until Belshazzar's mother told him to do so. Well, I've got this handwriting on the wall, but I'm going to ask my own prophetic figures here who are miserably unable to do it. And so he doesn't call Daniel right away. But that may be a geographical problem. Now, this vision, if we've read it correctly, look at verse 3, first part now. Then I lifted up mine eyes. It seems to me that Daniel is awake this time when he has this vision. He's not asleep. We have some other types of visions in Scripture, Genesis chapters 10 and also verse 16 here of this text, which reads and gives us a hint that he was awake. And I heard a man's voice, and he told Gabriel, make me understand this vision. Sounds to me like he's awake. And we have a vision like that in Genesis chapter 10, verse 22. Let's listen now as Daniel tells us the beginning of the vision. Then I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. Interesting reference to the Medo-Persians and Cyrus. A ram appeared on the canal bank, 2 horns. One horn was larger than the other, and it came up last. Cyrus conquered the Medes. And his horn then came up, his power came up last. The latter horn emerged, grew, and overshadowed the first one. In the 45th chapter of Isaiah, we have a reference that might help us with this vision of Daniel's about a ram with 2 horns. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden to subdue nations before him. I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the 2-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. Listen to God speaking to a man who's not alive yet. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, Jehovah, will call thee by thy name, am the God of Israel. For Jacob, my servant's sake, and Israel, mine elect, I have even called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. I am the Lord. There's none else. There's no God beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me. Cyrus, God's anointed leader, who will come up as the power in the Medo-Persian Empire, the higher of the 2 horns, Cyrus. And notice what this ram does. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward. This army of Cyrus pushes everywhere. Powerful army. That no beasts, nations, no, notice the word beast there, and then when you go to Revelation, a beast has to be some kind of a nation, might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. This Cyrus, named by Isaiah 150 years before Cyrus ever lived, named by Jeremiah 100 years before Cyrus ever lived, this one is God's power to defeat Babylon and allow his people, God's people, to go home. This ram now is charging in every direction. He's dominant. If Daniel had this vision in the days that we thought it was, around 547 BC, we might look at Isaiah 44. We were looking at Isaiah 45, but look at Isaiah 44 now, and let's take a look at a section here about this problem. 44:24. And God says, I make all things. That saith of Cyrus, verse 28, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple the foundation shall be laid. Isn't that amazing? Jews weren't in captivity when Isaiah wrote that. In fact, the Assyrians had not yet conquered the northern tribes when Isaiah wrote that. An amazing prophecy. And names him. These prophets did. They named him. How is that possible? I don't know what's going to happen in the next 100 minutes, let alone the next 100 years. But they named him. And Daniel says, I saw it. I saw that Persian empire. I saw there was one that was more powerful than all the others. That's Cyrus. Ezekiel, 2 Chronicles. In fact, Josephus said Cyrus read Isaiah. I don't know about that. That's in that's in Josephus' book, Antiquities. Did he? Somehow God stirred him up, and he must have seen one of those scrolls with his name on it. I wonder what he thought about his Marduk when he read that. Did he think that was Marduk telling him that? He indicates that on the cylinder, that his God told him that he would be the conqueror. But it was the God of heaven who named him. That's an interesting dilemma. God used a very evil king to do God's bidding. Not the first time. God used Pharaoh, raised him up to show God's power, according to Romans chapter 9. Well, let's read verses 5 and 6 now. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat, now we have another military leader, came from the west, Greece. Persia's over here to the east. Comes from the west. This he-goat. On the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. He has an army that can move quickly. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. He's very powerful. And he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had been seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. Alexander attacked the Persians. And Alexander the Great, the goat, prevailed. According to verse 7, and I saw him come close in unto the ram, and he was moved with choler, anger against him, and smote the ram, brake his two horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. According to history, Alexander died at the age of 33 in Babylon, the city of Babylon. He had retreated there from being almost in India. We don't know from what Alexander died, but we do know what happened for the next 22 years in history. His generals fought over who would divide Alexander's kingdom. And there were a number of these generals: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucid, and Ptolemy would prevail eventually. But there were others. And we're told here in verse 8 that the goat died when he was still strong. One historian wrote that Alexander wept because he had no more worlds he could conquer. Well, I don't know about that. But I do know he did die at a young age. And as I said, 4 notable ones came up. Those are the generals I just mentioned: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucid, Ptolemy. We're going to be interested in 2 of them especially. Ptolemy will take over in the area of Egypt. Seleucid will take over in the area of Syria and Israel and other places. And these generals, as I said, fought over this area for at least 22 years. Now notice that each one of these went in a different direction, according to Daniel's vision. He saw they're not all going to take the same territory. They went toward the 4 winds of heaven. All right? That's so precise and so amazing that Daniel was allowed to see how those generals would try to divide Alexander's kingdom toward the glorious land, Palestine. That's where they were headed. In verse 9, and out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land, glorious land. That's Palestine. So one of these, who is a descendant of one of those generals, will fix his eyes on the Jews. Well, a little horn. A little horn. Jeremiah spoke of this kind of thing, Jeremiah 3:19. Zechariah reminded his people of this kind of thing, Zechariah 7:14. Ezekiel mentioned it, Ezekiel 20:6-15. A little horn. One of the 4 horns now is Cassander, Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucid in Syria. Keep him in mind. One of his descendants is the little horn in this text. And that little horn is wicked. Let's read now. And it, that little horn, waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host of the stars in the grounds and stamped upon them. Alexander the Great, 13 years. Several years, almost a century after Cyrus' death, the only way to account for Daniel's long-range vision, divine inspiration. Can't account for it any other way. To see the descendant of a Seleucid general who will stamp upon Israel and trouble Daniel, of course, in his vision. Let me back up just a moment. Think about Cyrus' dynasty, 559 to 536. He reigned that long, and then Cambyses reigned. Then Smerdis the usurper reigned. Then Darius Astapus reigned a long time, 35 years. Then came Xerxes, Esther's husband. Artaxerxes, a long time. 114 years altogether of that empire. Ahasuerus' fleet, you remember, was defeated by Greece at Salamis in 482 BC. Esther became the queen of Persia then, 482 BC. Now this little horn, this descendant of one of the generals of Alexander, would be very successful. He would oppress the pleasant land, God's glorious people, Palestine. He would defile the temple. Let's read. He magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down, and an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and cast down the truth to the ground. It practiced and prospered. He will defile the temple. The prince of the host, the high priest, perhaps, or even God, maybe he means. Either way, the same point is being made. The daily offerings, of course, were to be offered. Exodus chapter 29, Exodus chapter 29, and Numbers chapter 28. Those daily offerings had to be made. He stopped it, this little horn. They besought the Lord, the people did, about this. And it's interesting that in a book we know as 2 Maccabees, this very event is mentioned that Daniel saw of this little horn. And in that 2 Maccabees 10:4, we read this: they besought the Lord, lying prostrate on the ground, that they might no more fall into such evil. But if they should at any time sin, that they might be chastised by God gently, and not be delivered up to be delivered into the blasphemous man's hands, the little horn. Suddenly, as he sees this vision of a little horn, Daniel heard something. Then I heard one saint speak, and another said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, Until 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And it came to pass, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. Suddenly, Daniel heard an angel speaking. The little horn's atrocities are called the transgressions of desolation. How long? 2,300 literal days? Perhaps. That would be 6 years, 4 months of desolation. The little horn, the descendant of that Seleucian general, is Antiochus Epiphanes. He began his destructive work in 170 BC. He murdered the high priest Onias III in December of 164 BC. The little horn died. 1,150 literal days, or 2,300 sacrifices. The point is moot. It's symbolic. It's talking about an indefinite desolation. Interestingly, this Antiochus Epiphanes only made 2 trips to Israel, to Palestine. Just 2. And Josephus says of him the following: he vandalized the temple, left it bare, forbade the daily sacrifices, burned down the finest buildings, built a citadel in the lower part of the city where wicked Jews lived, built an idol on God's altar, and offered pigs there, disbanded the Jewish order, of worship, compelled Jews to raise altars in every city and village, and to offer pigs there every day, forbade circumcision. Those who disobeyed were whipped and turned to pieces, whipped until they fell apart, killed. Women who had their sons circumcised, the women were strangled, and the baby hung around their necks, dead. He destroyed every Old Testament scroll he could find. Little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes. Now Gabriel's going to tell Daniel. So he, Gabriel, came near where I stood, and when he came I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O Son of Man, for all the time of the end shall be the vision. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me straight. Now this part of the explanation came after Daniel fainted from seeing the first part. He will faint again. And he's going to be told here what's going to happen. And he said, Gabriel did, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. I'm going to tell you all about this, Daniel, this little horn, this Antiochus Epiphanes, and what's going to come at the end of what he does. Keep in mind Gabriel here. He's talking to Daniel about the vision, and it's Gabriel who will explain to Daniel further when Messiah will come. That's chapter 9. And he will give Daniel the exact time in history when that will occur. And keep in mind again, we're only in the time of 4 world empires: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And right now, this is the time of the 4 notable ones, those 4 generals who took over Alexander's kingdom, but we're all the way down to the intertestament period now. We're in between Malachi and Matthew in time of history. We're in the Maccabean time, intertestament time. And Daniel is seeing way off in the future now, centuries, this vision of this little horn. So Gabriel says, now he tells us what we've already made known. The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, we know who that is, Cyrus. All right, got that right? Now, that being broken, whereas and the rough goat is the king of Greece. Well, we know who that is. That's Alexander. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Well, that would be Philip, and then, of course, Alexander. Now, that being broken, that king, Alexander, 4 come, those are those 4 generals. 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. Those 4 won't be as powerful as Alexander was, and they weren't. But again, Ptolemy's in Egypt. The Seleucids are in Syria, in that area. And in the latter time of their kingdom, intertestament period, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance, understanding dark sentences, shall stand up. That's our little horn. That's Antiochus Epiphanes. When we read the 9th chapter of 2nd Maccabees, we read about a family that turned itself against Antiochus. We're going to read about the Maccabees. We're going to read about them by name. We're also going to be told in that chapter that Antiochus himself was tortured by some loathsome disease. And so the Maccabees choked him out, really. Josephus seems to confirm the idea of 2,300 sacrifices would be destroyed rather than 2,300 literal days. But Brother Turner took this point to the intertestament period of those number of days as a total of 3 years of time for the intertestament revolt against Antiochus. It's a moot point because Daniel is referring to what happened to his people more than what happened in history. Now in verse 15 here, you read the Bible's record of the interpretation of Daniel's vision by Gabriel. So we are assured that we have the right interpretation. No doubt about it. And in the latter time of their kingdom, that fierce king, Antiochus Epiphanes, will arise. This is a terrible time now in the history of Jerusalem. I remember when Brother Turner was talking to us about Antiochus and how the Jews called him something else, gave him not the nickname Epiphanes. But here's a man who thought of himself as God. Epiphanes. He is a man who took upon himself the matter of life and death. Can you imagine? Of being that powerful in your way of thinking? Here's a man who was as evil as they come, but he was powerful. In that intertestament period, we read about Mattathias, who revolted against the guards, the army of Antiochus, some soldiers, and he was killed, and the sons revolted and killed those soldiers. And this started the Maccabean Revolution. Judas Maccabees became the leader of those people. There is one, John Hyrcanus, that's part of that group. Eleazar, in a battle, stood under an elephant and killed it and was crushed by the elephant. But you have a revolt now called the Maccabean Revolt. And this is what makes the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees important to us, because they affirm what Daniel saw here hundreds of years before it happened. The intertestament period was a time of turmoil. It was a time of terrible activity against the Jews. But the worst of all was this little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes, the most cruel of all, and what he did to the Jews. Can you imagine requiring that they offer a pig? You remember that the pigs were not edible to the Jew. He was not allowed to eat pork. And so what Antiochus Epiphanes knew was how to insult them tremendously, how to be evil toward them. And for Daniel to have to see that had to cause him terrible, terrible, terrible anguish. What is going on here? Anti-Semitism is not a new thing. To be anti-Jew is popular among all kinds of people. It would be interesting to note that the very foreign policy of the United States of America is based on a doctrine called premillennialism. That is, that all of the Jews one day will be gathered back in Israel, and Jesus will come and sit on the throne and judge the world from there. The Bible doesn't teach that, certainly not. But in their doctrine, the premillennialists have an annihilation of Palestine and a battle of Armageddon taking place there between the Red Chinese and the Roman Empire. And the Chinese have crossed a dried up Euphrates-Tigris River, according to this doctrine. It's all made up, of course. It's not taught in Scripture. And so they take some of these things that Daniel saw here in history that's already occurred, incidentally. Remember, you have to stop at the Roman Empire with Daniel. Can't go past that. And the Roman Empire will start at the end of the Intertestament period. Probably with Augustus, maybe with Julius Caesar, some think. But nevertheless, we're at the end of Daniel's vision when we get to the Roman Empire. But here is our foreign policy based on the thought that the Jews have a right to be restored to Israel. Well, we have a premillennial foreign policy. But we should not, as Christians, hate any people. If I've read the Bible correctly, I've found out from the books of the New Testament that in today's world there are just two groups of people, saved and lost. There are members of the Church of Christ, His body, to which God added them, and there are those who aren't. And those who aren't need a plea to be heard. They need to hear that they need to be in that body in order to be saved. In Ephesians 5:23, He is the Savior of the body. Now, Daniel said that in the days of the Roman Empire, Daniel 2:44, that last empire that Daniel will have in his vision, the Messiah would come and start that kingdom. Did God do it then? Daniel said so. Did these things happen that we're reading about here in the Intertestament period? They absolutely did. Did Daniel see them ahead of time? Yes. So what does Daniel tell us then will be about the Messiah's kingdom? In the days of those kings, those Roman kings, those Roman emperors. But before that happens, this little horn will come. Now let's read verse 24. And his power, that's Antiochus Epiphanes, shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He thought it was. He thought he was God. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. Well, I've already read to you what Josephus said he did. And though through his policy also, he shall cause craft to prosper in his name. They're going to make money making idols to his God. And he shall magnify himself in his heart. Oh, did he ever? He thought he was God. He shall also stand up against the Prince of Princes, God, but he shall be broken without hand. He's going to not die a natural death. And again, he was tortured by some disease toward the end of his life. Antiochus Epiphanes was. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore seal it, shut up the vision, Daniel, for it shall be for many days. Daniel, what I just told you is true, and this vision is going to be for many days. What did you see, Daniel? I saw the Persian Empire rise. And one of the Persian kings became the most powerful. That's Cyrus. No doubt about it, Daniel says so, and Gabriel told him that. So the message from heaven is, that's Cyrus. That's Persia. Then I saw a goat attack Cyrus. And the goat won. But then he died. And 4 notable ones came. Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucid, Ptolemy. Seleucid, Syria, Ptolemy, Egypt. They would do battle against each other, oftentimes, many times. They will battle each other for supremacy through history. And out of the loins of one of those Seleucid generals will come a fierce, fierce person, a cruel person, a little horn out of that. Not the other little horn we read about, but this is a different little horn. This is an intertestament person. This is Antiochus Epiphanes. and he will be an abomination of desolation. In their history, there is much troubling. So let's see how Daniel felt when he heard all that. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I got up, did the king's business. I wonder if that's a reference to he went back about the handwriting. And I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. He got it. Nobody else did. How do you feel when you read this kind of thing in the Old Testament? Isaiah said, in 150 years there's going to be a man named Cyrus. He'll be God's tool. Jeremiah said, going to be Cyrus. That's 100 years before it happened. Here comes Cyrus, and he's stirred up to let the Jews come home from Babylon to Palestine in 536 BC. What's going on here? Daniel, meanwhile, still over here in the area of Babylon, in the city of Susa, seeing a vision of the intertestament period up to the Roman Empire. Wow, what a book. Daniel is in Babylonian captivity, lived through the Persian time, all the way up to Cyrus. Probably Daniel is in his 90s when he dies. I don't know, somewhere along there. But what a prophecy. Now, as we close today, I want to ask a question. How can you ever account for what Daniel saw here in such a precise way about history that he never lived, except that God told him this a long time before it happened? This is extremely good proof, excellent proof of the inspiration of God's holy word. Daniel saw 4 empires, and 2 here in detail as to what would happen in history. I know that some say, well, somebody had to write that later on. This book's too old, too well attested for an argument like that. And so as we study this book, we come to chapter 9 in the next session, and then 10, 11, and 12. Let's keep in mind God's inspired prophet, Daniel. May God bless you in your study of God's Word.